Hello! In this video we're going to look at the start of the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1921. This is in the first theme of our specification, which looks at politics, and as you can see I've just outlined that there. In this video I really want to give kind of an outline of what was happening before the October Revolution and what happened in the few years immediately after it. So let's start with what was going on before 1917 in Russia. So there was Tsar Nicholas II. He was a Tsar, obviously. Tsars were kings of Russia, and they believed that they were chosen by God. The religion at the time was Orthodox Christianity, and a lot of what Tsar Nicholas did in particular was he rekindled the connection between the church and the monarchy. He was brought to the throne at a very young age. He made lots of mistakes, some more understandable than others. He's famous for being involved with Rasputin, which is a fun Google search if you are interested in that kind of thing. And he was generally considered to be too inexperienced. He was a fan of opulent dinner parties and that kind of stuff. And then probably his fatal mistake, at least in my opinion, was his decision to join the First World War. In the context of this, there is the battle between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. Although there was a monarchy, there was some form of political discourse between people who weren't royals, and that would occur in local Soviets. There was also a body called the Duma, which I won't focus on too much, but largely it was to do with the Soviets, and you had two splitting ideologies. They were both on the left, so it's not as if one was right wing, the other was left wing. It was very much a communist socialist dispute. On one hand, you have the Mensheviks. They believed that a revolution, so if you look back to our first lesson when we were looking at the idea of a proletarian revolution, they believed it would happen with time. There was no need to rush it, and that once the revolutions happened in Britain and Germany, that would then spread across the world. They would then support Russia, and we would have a global socialist, classless state. Then you've got the Bolsheviks. They were led by Lenin, and they had a different idea when it came to revolutionary Marxism. So their idea was that there needs to be a vanguard party, and by vanguard I mean a party to bring about a revolution. Lenin thought that he and his Bolsheviks were that vanguard party, and that they would have to violently overthrow the Tsar to bring about a socialist revolution. They did not think that it would happen over time. They thought they needed to force it, and so that was where they differed. Now, in February of 1917, there was a revolution. People took to the streets, they were angry at a lack of bread, and they overthrew the Tsar. He was forced to resign in a carriage somewhere. Then came a provisional government. These were largely liberals. They were educated academics, those kind of people. They're very much bourgeois. And they were led by a guy called Kerensky. They decided not to leave the First World War, and they made a few quite big mistakes. So when it came to protests, they didn't do much. There was a coup by a general called Kornilov, which they responded to by arming the Bolsheviks and telling them to defend the Provisional Government. This led directly to the October Revolution. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, with their arms, quite ironically, given to them by the Provisional Government, stormed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd at that time, and got rid of the Provisional Government, essentially. Before we move on to what actually happened in 1917 after the October Revolution, I'd like to look into a bit about Lenin in particular. So Lenin isn't his real name, it's a party name, which means that he used it to avoid a capture during the times of the Tsar. He was a prominent troublemaker, essentially. He was an educated lawyer, and when we look at Lenin, it's quite tempting to say that what made him a revolutionary was the death of his brother. As a child, his brother was a conspirator in a plot to overthrow the Tsar. He was hung, and so that is considered to have sparked Lenin's ideology and his future actions. I personally think that he was just an educated guy. He came across the teachings almost of Marxism, and that really inspired him. He is a divisive figure. Some people say that he is a messiah-like figure. Others say that he's a bit of a pragmatist. Some on the right would just say he's not a very nice word. So there's lots of debate surrounding Lenin. It's also very difficult to find out what kind of a man he was, because after he died, there was this huge attempt to create a cult of personality around him, which we'll look at in future videos. So, by accounts from the time, he was a very hard-working, very modest guy. He didn't live very nicely. He worked very hard, but there's no way we can prove or disprove that. So now, the Bolsheviks have overthrown the Tsar, and we're coming into 1917. So there are a few decrees, and by decrees I mean essentially laws, which were brought in immediately in October 1917. And those were the decrees on peace, which was a promise to leave the war, the decree on land, which was to redistribute some of the land, a decree on workers' rights, which brought in an 8-hour working day and a minimum wage. And there was finally, which came actually in January 1918, which was a decree on workers' control, which let workers elect their factory managers. What I've got here essentially is a diagram of what government was supposed to look like and what it actually looked like for the start of Russia. So at the top you've got the Sovnarkom, and then these, so essentially this is the lowest level, this is the top. So you'd have local Soviets, and just to clarify, a Soviet is a workers' union, I suppose. Workers would elect Soviet representatives, and they would discuss things and try and represent them. So you'd have Soviets at the bottom, and then people in the Soviets would elect to the All-Russian Congress, and then they would elect to the Sovnarkom. So Sovnarkom had about 13 people in it. These at the start were people like Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky. I don't want to say anyone else in case I get it wrong, but these were almost entirely prominent Bolsheviks. Then we have Constituent Assembly elections in January 1918. The Provisional Government, another mistake they made was they promised to have an elected body called the Constituent Assembly, but they never did. So what Lenin thought was, we'll have elections, we'll show that we're different from the Provisional Government. So we had these elections, and overwhelmingly the Bolsheviks lost. They were beaten by a group called the Social Revolutionaries. So what he did was he sent the police to close down the Constituent Assembly and said, no, this is an unfair election. And the reason it's unfair is because there is still bourgeois influence. So all of these people who voted for the SRs, they are in fact still bourgeois influences, and we can't let that into government. And you might think, alright, that's fair. Then you have, importantly, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. So this treaty essentially, it got Russia out of the First World War, but the issue with it was it gave away a lot of land to Germany, and this made the Bolsheviks quite unpopular. So by the time the Soviet elections came around in April, May 1918, they lost again. So what does Lenin do? He says, no, these elections they're not fair, and so we can't accept them again. He said, again, bourgeois influences, we need to keep a Bolshevik in power. As I'm sure you can imagine, this didn't go down too well. By January 1918. So this is before this, but it really kicks in after the failed Soviet elections. You have a civil war in Russia. We can split it up into 4 stages. The first of which being military. So these were generals like Kornilov. They were involved before the revolution and they wanted to take power again after. Then you had SRs and anarchists, so political groups who wanted to take power through a civil war. Then once they were defeated, we have probably the largest stage of the civil war, which were the whites. This is where we get the idea of the reds and the whites fighting each other. The whites were consistent mainly of supporters of the Tsar, in fact, most prominently supporters of the Tsar. You had support from England, or Britain even, America and Japan, and these whites were essentially anti-communists. They were kind of a ragtag bunch, but these were the largest opposition to the Reds. And finally you've got the Greens, which is another way of saying you've got peasants trying to take back control. In order to win the Civil War, because the Bolsheviks did win the Civil War, they rolled back a lot of the democratic institutions they'd put in place. So there was no longer democracy in the Red Army. There was also some major changes made to the political system. So looking back at essentially these two, it might be useful for me to separate them. So looking at this section, we have what was supposed to be a democratic institution, so the Solnicum at the top. These are all done by elections, essentially. And then you have this, so you have the Politburo of the party. What I like to think of this as is essentially a war cabinet. So the idea was, during a civil war, this was cut out, essentially. They got rid of it. And the reason was, obviously, you can't have a civil war against like SRs and anarchists and then have them elected in the Russian Congress. It doesn't make sense. Another key reason is that the Politburo was essentially there to have quick decisions, as you had even in Great Britain during the Second World War. You had Churchill's war cabinet, that kind of stuff. And this Politburo essentially took a place here, and it used Sovnarkom to validate its laws, but there was no debate at all. So discussion would happen in the Politburo, and it would get made into law. The Politburo was exclusively Bolshevik, and it was linked to local party branches, which are not nightclubs or anything. They're branches of the Bolshevik Party, and these were run by nomenklatura. So you'd have orders passed down from the Politburo to the local party, and they were carried out by the nomenklatura. The nomenklatura were the party's most loyal members. They were people who'd been promoted. They were, interestingly, mostly middle-class people, so they weren't workers or peasants. They were well-educated people. So, the war's over. The Reds have won. What happens after? And when I say the war's over, I mean this part of the war is over. Yeah, I've made such a mess, but so this part of the war upwards is over. Then you have the Kronstadt Mutiny of 1921. This is when the Kronstadt sailors near St. Petersburg, Kronstadt is a little island, they decided to mutiny, and they were swiftly defeated by the Reds. But what was so significant about the Kronstadt Mutiny is it was actually the Kronstadt sailors who had helped the Bolsheviks get into power in the first place. Then we have the Volga River protests. So in order to understand these protests, we need to look at what happened during the Civil War. During the Civil War, there was a policy of grain requisitioning, which meant that peasants would grow grain and the Red Army would just take it off them. It was either the Red Army or the secret police called the Cheka. And their job was to ensure that the war effort kept going. Back in the cities, there was a heavily centralised economy, which involved the nationalisation of all of the factories to just produce lots of weapons. So, the Volga River is a river in Russia, and what happened during these protests in 1921 was peasants, rather than giving their grain away to the Red Army, they decided to dump it in the river. So this was quite a organised, quite damaging, really, attack on grain requisitioning. So then you have this group, the Greens, emerging. So these Greens are saying that they are not happy with the policy of grain requisitioning, and they're saying that they are actually going to go to war with the Red Army if it continues. This is not a good situation to be in, because the overwhelming majority of Russia's population at the time were peasants. I think it's worth drawing a little pyramid here. It was essentially like this. So you had peasants on the bottom, workers actually here, and then the bourgeoisie at the top. So if the peasants went to war, there was going to be a big problem for Lenin. Now you have what is probably, I think, the defining moment in the period we're looking at, and that is the Party Congress, which decided on the new economic policy, which ended grain requisitioning. And then you have the resolution on party unity. What this means is that the NEP was largely, it was incredibly popular amongst the peasants, because obviously they weren't getting their food taken away from them anymore. But it was also really kind of unpopular with certain people within the party. Now Lenin thought, right, we're going to appease the peasants, but I can't let this appeasement split my party. So I'm going to make a rule which says that you are not allowed to create factions within the party. And that's what the resolution on party unity is. By the end of 1921, the state, as I'm sure you can see by this awful, awful drawing, is so much different to the way it started out. The principles are different. You have what is essentially a capitalist system, following a very heavily communist system. So you've got a state which has been, because of war, been forced to be quite pragmatic. And so you have a state which, by the end of it all, has the Bolsheviks very firmly in power. The main changes, I think, are the change from the Soviet state, so the change from this system, to the party state, which is this system, because I'm going to be a bit opinionated here, and I'm going to say that Lenin didn't really want to have a party state. He wanted to have a state with his party in power, but he didn't want to remove democracy. I think he was someone who very much enjoyed the legitimacy of having political elections. But by the end of it, you have Lenin, who's seen that you can't allow democracy because it doesn't result in him staying in power. So you have such a strong Bolshevik party at the top of the political institutions. Now we've got a change from workers being as a whole, so this party here, this group of people here being in control, to only the Bolsheviks being in control. Now it's important to remember that a worker and a Bolshevik isn't necessarily the same thing. Bolsheviks were just people with a certain political ideology. They could have been very wealthy, they could have been workers, but you have a state which started off as the workers and peasants state, and it's turned into the Bolshevik state. Now finally, this is a change which happened around this time here. But the change from pluralism, and by pluralism I mean discussion within the party, to a very singular party ideology. Now, this is something I haven't really addressed, but I think it might be worth talking about, and that's that at the start of, before 1917, there was pluralism. So people would disagree. You'd have like Stalin say disagreeing with Trotsky. In fact, that happened a lot. But the idea was, well, we make a decision, and then whatever decision we make, everyone in the party backs it, and that's called democratic centralism. At this point, there's just this idea, well, we're backing the NEP, and if anyone has anything to say about it, I don't care. We're doing this because it ensures the survival of our party, and that is shown by the resolution on party unity. Now, I say that this is the end of pluralism. It's kind of the beginning of the end. We see the real end of pluralism, I think, under Stalin, but this is where it kind of begins to stop. I hope this video has been useful to you. I'm sure there are some mistakes I'm going to have to edit over, because I've done this in one take, but I hope to see you again next time.